Next to the blue states of New York and California, Texas has the greatest presence or number of Chinese Americans who call the Lone Star State home and whose roots stretch way, way back and are intertwined with America's history. VOA's Elizabeth Lee tells us the full story.
In this library at Rice University in Houston, the stories of Asian Texans are waiting to be unboxed. The Houston Asian American Archive includes some 500 first-hand accounts of Asian immigrants and their descendants.
My father came from China.
Oral history gives you a sense of immediacy.
Unlike many of their counterparts, these Asian Americans ventured away from cities like San Francisco and even New York to settle much further south. Among the artifacts are pieces of Albert G's life.
Albert G's CACA plaque.
His daughter, Linda Wu, has kept some of her father's photos.
To the White House for a state dinner. My dad was born here in the United States. His father and mother had a laundry.
When G's father died in 1927, he went to China with his mother and siblings. But he returned to the U.S. with his godfather a few years later.
Albert found himself only around 11 years old, coming back to the United States.
G eventually ended up in Houston with the help of friends and relatives. Here he opened restaurants, which attracted Hollywood celebrities who would stay at a nearby hotel.
Bob Hope.
G also helped other new Chinese immigrants settle. As established families helped newcomers from China, the number of G's grew in Houston. Not all who shared the G name were related. Recorded in this book are some of their stories, including that of Rogine G. Calvert's father, David G. He came to the U.S. at age 17 in the late 1920s as a so-called paper son.
At that time, we had the Chinese Exclusion Act,
which banned many Chinese from immigrating to the U.S.
Paper sons and paper daughters are the name given to people who buy false papers.
They were rightfully looking for people that were breaking the law, and unfortunately my dad was one.
After being detained for almost a year at the Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco, California, Calvert's father was granted permission to stay. He eventually married and settled in Houston, Texas. He worked in the grocery business with the help of other G's. Chow says the first large group of Chinese immigrants arrived in Houston in the 1940s and 50s. Racial segregation was legal in Texas and southern states through a series of codes known as Jim Crow laws.
Even though Houston also was subject to Jim Crow law, the law wasn't applied the same way as the other southern states. And so there's a sense of more equity in Houston. That's why people come, a sense of business opportunity.
Restaurateur Albert G. took part in desegregating Houston's eateries. His work in the community would eventually be immortalized years later in a web comic developed by Asia Society Texas.
Kids all across the state of Texas are reading the comic. Our Asian American students in particular said they want to see themselves represented.
Asia Society Texas also worked with the Houston Asian American Archive to develop lesson guides for teachers in the state so students can explore further the history of the Asian Americans who make up the fabric of the city. Elizabeth Lee, VOA News, Houston.